Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of Beyond the Album Cover with yours truly, Jarrell Mason, where we get inside the entertainment industry with those in the know and give them their flowers while they're here to be celebrated. And with me right now on the podcast, I have a man. If you've listened to TV, radio, video games within the past 4 decades, you know this man's work. And we're going to get into his career and then some. And when I was a college radio DJ, I took inspiration in one of his famous IDs for a little radio station that you might know, WQHT New York, Hot 97. I have the one, the only Mr. Rick Allen with me. Rick, welcome to Beyond the Album Cover.
Thank you for even having an interest in what the heck I do, because I always have been a behind the scenes guy, and so I don't get the glory that the DJs and the air personalities got, but I just love what I do. And so it's like to have some recognition, believe me, it is humbling.
Yes, sir. And for those of us who love radio, we know all about who does the imaging and does the behind the scenes work that makes everybody else look good. So you deserve every little bit of flowers that you're getting today on this podcast.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
All right, so let's go ahead and jump right into it. What made you want to get into the radio business, and did you always have an aspiration to be behind the scenes or on air at first and then later found out behind the scenes was more my cup of tea?
Well, I mean, it was an interesting kind of path into that, and it actually started out. I've been actually, it's kind of crazy to think about it, but I've drew my first professional paycheck for audio when I was 15 years old, and I'm 61, and I haven't done anything but audio my whole life. So it's the only thing I'm qualified for other than that is, I think, to say hi, welcome to Walmart. so I've got to keep my day gig, man. But what happened was I started out as a radio DJ when I was 15, and one of the things I discovered was when you were live on the air, because back then there wasn't this voice tracking, it was live radio. And I found that I wasn't quite as slick and skilled live that I wanted to be. And so when you made mistakes live on the air as a DJ, everybody heard it, and it was kind of embarrassing. So when I got into the production studio and started working with tape and starting being able to, if I made a mistake, I erased it, I fixed it. So nobody ever heard the product until it was polished. And that's what I loved doing that. And I loved getting people's attention through sound. Those things that go on between the records, the sweepers and the IDs, really I was always looking for interesting sounds. And that's what kind of started it through high school. And then I put myself through college working at a radio station as their production director, and continued to enjoy kind of sculpting that craft. Then after I graduated from college, ended up in Dallas, Texas at back in the day when the singing jingles, the WABC kind of things. I worked for TM Productions, which was one of the big, huge jingle houses back in the day. And then kind of slowly worked back into it, and kept kind of trying new things and experimenting, trying to keep on the cutting edge. And that's where it kind of led me to New York City and Hot.
Now you mentioned TM out of Dallas. Now, was Jam's a rival jingle house?
Yes, but very friendly rivalry. It's kind of interesting. John Wolford owns Jam, and the singers that sang at Jam, they would sing in the afternoon at Jam, and they would sing in the morning at TM. It would be the same independent jingle singers. So the interesting thing is, that's why all those jingles sounded somewhat familiar and similar. It's because a lot of those were the same jingle singers on those packages.
Wow, I never knew that, because I always thought that the companies had their own in-house singers. So how long would it take for the rival companies to knock out a jingle package, depending on how many affiliates you have signing up to use a particular package?
That's what the concept back in the day for that was usually, and it's still this kind of same kind of concept, they would take a little bit of a loss on the custom package on creating it if they found a big station that would want to have something done. For instance, WABC in New York, WLS in Chicago, KISS FM in LA. Those kind of stations were big stations back then. So they would come in and want a custom package built from scratch. That would take because you'd have to get the rhythm section in. You'd have to, it would have to be written and approved to begin with. The rhythm section would come in, then the horn section, if there were violins or anything involved there, then the singers would come in and sing the final package. Where the companies like this tend to make their money was syndicating it, which is taking that package, those music beds, the music and the effects, and having the jingle singers come in, and all you'd have to do is just have the jingle singers sing the new call letters or the new radio station name. And they could do that for stations all across the country at a fairly reasonable rate because they only had to pay the singers at that point.
Now, was it a separate rate if the DJs wanted their own customized jingles?
Funny thing, the DJs in those days, really the radio station would usually pick up the tab on those. They would have the DJs custom sing their name custom sang, and the station would pay for it. It wasn't until later when we got into the economic times where things got a little tight and the stations didn't want to pay for those kind of things, that the local DJs would pay for their own jock shouts or their own sweepers and that sort of thing. That's fairly, well, I shouldn't say fairly new. It's probably been going on for 20 years, but that wasn't something that was going on back in the early 80s and late 80s.
Right. And I'm sure there was probably a lot of deals made like, hey, do this for us and we'll trade you airtime or some other things for that, brokering deals.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, that's where my business really took off after Hot 97, which was I had a package out called Continuous Climax, which was an imaging. It was a pre-produced package that was always updated, that was for radio stations to use all across the country to make their products sound as best as they can. And that was actually the term is barter. And it was we ended up, the station would get it for free if they would agree to play a 1 minute advertisement every day that we could then turn around and sell to a national advertiser. So everybody it was a win-win for everybody.
Right. And if you know radio like I do, it will either be in the form of a commercial or DJ would come on and do a live read, something like this. This product is brought to you by Rick Allen Creative Services. For all your imaging, ID, jingles, and sweepers needs, go to Rick Allen at Rick Allen Creative Services at number insert here, website insert here, and back to the music.
Yep, absolutely.
Right. Now, back in the 60s and the 70s, what I noticed in radio was that a lot of DJs, especially in the big union markets, didn't operate their own board. And you normally would have somebody behind the glass operating the board or the spin pots and the cart machines. Did you do any of that work before fully transition on the production side?
No, because I came into the business right about the transition of that, and I didn't get to that still was the everyday kind of routine in the large markets because of the unions. In New York, Chicago, and LA, a lot of those DJs didn't run their own board. They had an engineer that would run it for them. But by the time I got into the business and made it to the larger markets, that was pretty much, for instance, at Hot 97, the DJs ran their own board. There wasn't any union engineer. Because when you're running a very tight radio show, think about how difficult it is for that timing. There was it was almost like a marriage between the engineer and the DJ, because he or she would have to, point their finger like, okay, hit that next button so the music starts here, or this jingle starts here, or that sort of thing. So there was to run that really exciting top 40, very tight production was not an easy thing to do with two people. And it's like people like Broadway Bill Lee. That guy ran such a tight board on his own that I think if I remember right, there were times where he ran it. It was in a union shop and he did not run his own board. But for the most part, his show just blossomed. I think was amazing when he was running his own board.
Right. I definitely agree, because radio, for those of you that are uninitiated, it is a science to it, because you have to be tight with your board. You have to know your clock, know when to get in and out of your breaks, know your stop sets. And whatever you do, do not talk over the intro of a record. Be sure to hit that post.
Absolutely. And then it wasn't computerized. I mean, these days you've got voice tracking, which the DJs record their banter, long before the music is ever played, before it's not live. But back when it was live, you had to, I remember some of the DJs at Hot would be interviewing a listener, getting a request, having them ask for a record or something, and they'd be preparing that tape for a playback. As that last song was fading out, they'd be getting everything ready and put their headphones on, and it was breathtaking how fast paced the environment was there.
Yeah, because I was telling a lot of people, I probably wouldn't have had a steady hand to splice edit those reel to reels and on the editing block, because you really had to have the hands of steel and knew exactly where to mark with that grease pencil, because if you marked the wrong spot, there was no, oh, let me undo this edit. You were screwed if you edit the wrong thing on
Yeah.
the splice tape.
I mean, in the world of digital audio that we have now, it's like you hit a key and you undo it and you can start over again. There it was, you would physically splice the tape together. If you wanted to put it back together, you had to take it apart, put it back together. And I think I'll show you, I don't know if you'd be able to see it, but there's a little bit of my finger missing right about there. That's from a razor blade when I was cutting tape with a razor blade and just sliced through my finger. And only did that once. That was a lesson learned. But
Man.
but it got to the point where when it came to analog tape, which was the way we recorded things, and you'd have to physically splice things, I'd be able to carry on a conversation with you while moving the reel to reel around and listening with the back of my mind, hearing something and mark it. And I could do I could edit through an entire piece without ever really having to closely pay attention. It was almost second nature, which was fun.
Yeah, and the crazy thing about those early days in radio with the technology not being there, a lot of the mix show DJs, they would do their shows on reel to reels and they would bring it into the studio, load it up and play it. But just the creativity they really had to do, where you had all of these splice tape edits all in the reel to reel, and then to really just be creative because you had to make do with what you had.
With the mixers, the mix DJs and the people that do special edits at Hot was amazing, because back in the days of analog tape, literally, because I don't know if your viewers and listeners kind of remember the analog days, but there are little pieces of white or blue tape that you would use to splice two pieces of analog tape together. It was like Scotch tape. And there were times when the guys would bring in a new edit for a hot mix, and you'd put it on the tape machine and it would go by, and there were just, they do 16 notes edits or even more, and the edits were this big, and it would just be like edit, and it was just amazing to visually watch that go by on the tape machine. You wouldn't hear it because the edits were so good, but it was just amazing, the talent that those guys had.
And before FM really took hold for music, AM was the dominant dial in which music was on. And a lot of AM stations, a lot of them were daytime stations where they'll be on during the day. And then when it came sundown, power down at night to protect your big stations in other markets. And that's why you had stations like WLS, WABC out of New York had a national reach, because when those smaller stations signed off, when it was sundown, it expanded their demo and their listening audience.
It also influenced, it almost became a style nationally, because it influenced what everybody else listened to. I mean, growing up, I listened to WLS at night. I grew up in Indianapolis, Indiana. I grew up in the Midwest. And I grew up listening to WLS all the time because it was the big 50,000 watt AM station. And I listened to WABC. You could pick up all those stations. And so you could hear the big city in a medium or small town. You could be exposed to the big city style of radio. So you aspired to that, and that changed a little bit when FM became a big thing, because FM obviously doesn't have that reach. And then it got to the point where after that, if you were really a radio geek, you'd end up having people record on cassette just the DJs talking in between, not the songs, but just in between the songs. And they were called air checks. And you'd end up, swapping cassettes with friends all around the country, going, hey, do you have any, WABC air checks that I can listen to? And they'd copy them off and send them to you so you could hear what those stations sounded like. If you couldn't pick up the FM signal. So it was, and then that was a real a real honor for me when I was working in New York at Hot, because people would call from St. Louis and say, "Hey, I heard that promo or that sweeper you did. Where'd you get that particular sound, or how'd you do this?" And I was amazed and kind of flabbergasted that anybody was even, anybody outside of New York was listening to what we were doing. It was put a little bit of pressure on you.
Yeah, and that leads me to my next question. How did the famous top of the hour ID for Hot 97 come about, which goes from the top of the Empire State Building, WQHT, New York, Hot 97?
I actually, there is a fun story to that. The gentleman that was the announcer, the voice of all the IDs for Hot 97 was a guy named Chuck Riley, who I grew up listening to because he was actually from Indianapolis also. And big, huge, wonderful, big booming bass voice. And we got a recording in from him. He was in LA at the time and recorded from the top of the Empire State Building. I believe it or not, at the time, it was from the top of the World Trade Center. We hadn't moved our transmitter yet. And the tape came in, and my boss, Joe Sokolowitz, who was just a crazy creative genius as a boss, he was great to work for. And he said, "Hey, I'm hearing in my head, I'm hearing this thing. I want it to sound like it's coming from the top of the building. I want it to project from the top." And so I went back. I had a home. I've always had a home studio, even if I worked for a radio station. I always wanted a kind of a creative lab that I could play in by myself. So I took the tape home to my studio at home, and I will admit that at the time I like to end the day with a rum and coke. So I had a couple of rum and cokes and was feeling pretty good. So I loaded this into the sampler, which is a musical instrument at the time that everybody's probably familiar with now, but it was pretty new at the time, where you could stutter and you could do things with things. And so I just started playing around. And I that night, it was in one night, I kind of visualized that this signal was going from the top, and kind of going up and out. So I did the pitch shift up, and I did a few other effects like that. And it was a pretty active idea. I guess active is the way to put it. I went in the next morning, and the corporate technical engineer for the whole corporation was in town. And Joel and I went into the production studio, and Terry walked in behind us, and I played it for my boss. I played it for Joel, and Terry interrupted everything and just went, "Terribly overproduced. It'll burn out in a couple of days. It's too much." And Joel goes, "No, I think I like it. Let's try it." We laugh about it because years later, Terry came by again, and he goes, "What are you doing, Rick?" And I go, "Just sitting around overproducing," was always my joke to him, because that ID ran for close to, I think, 8 years. It ran every hour on the hour. So it didn't burn out. People loved it, people enjoyed it, and it kind of developed a reputation of its own, a life of its own.
Right. It definitely was and still is one of the premier IDs for us radio geeks, just like how if you went up the dial to Z100 and heard their flamethrower package from
Absolutely.
Jams, it's that calling card to let you know, hey, this is our station.
And when I got to New York, J.R. Nelson was the production director at Z100, and then later Dave Fox came on board. And we were absolutely competitive, but at the same time, Dave Fox is, to this day, I feel bad that we haven't talked for a while, but great friend. I mean, a great guy, wonderful person. I never felt any, the competition was actually, for me at least, I can't speak for him, but for me, it was very positive competition, where I didn't want I didn't wish him any harm or any bad luck. I just wanted to be as good as he was, or try to be a little bit better every time. So it was a great positive competition in that market that I think brought everybody's quality up.
Yeah, because the radio at that time in the Big Apple was serious. You had Hot 97, you had Z100, you had WPLJ, you had 107.5 WBLS, and at the time 98.7 KISS, and they were all battling for that top spot in New York.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, yeah, every listener was important. It was a time when, I think you kind of pointed it out. If you grew up in that time listening to one of those stations in New York, you really felt loyalty to those stations. It wasn't as if you were like, I don't care what I'm listening to, I'll just dial around. You were a fan. There were people that were serious fans of Z100, and they were, they were anti Hot 97 or anti Hot 103, and there were Hot 103 fans that thought Z100 was terrible. So there was some interesting listener loyalty, and we tried very hard to develop that.
Mm. And for those that don't know, originally Hot 97 was on the 103 dial, and it was Hot 103, and then they later ended up moving up down the dial to Hot 97, where they still are to this day. Do you know the reason why the switch behind going from 103 to 97?
Yep. At least this is as I remember it. My memory is, I don't know about how good my memory is, but what it was Hot 103 was owned by a company called MS Broadcasting, and the 97 frequency was WYNY, which was an NBC owned radio station. And MS actually bought the NBC, or a couple of the NBC stations, if I remember right. And at the time, the 103 frequency was from the World Trade Center. This was before 9/11. And so the transmitter was down on the World Trade Center, and the 97 frequency was on the Empire State Building. And the signal from the southern part of Manhattan had there's a problem with FM in big cities where you get between buildings and that sort of thing, where the signal kind of flakes out a little bit. And so the 103 frequency was not as well received, or wasn't as clear in the city as it was in the suburbs. And the 97 frequency was great in the city and was a little weaker in the burbs. And what MS was smart enough to do is, when they had both frequencies, they realized Hot 103, or the hot format, was very city oriented, was more for the Manhattan crowd. So they wanted a better signal that would cover the city better. And the country station on 97 would have been, and was just fine on the 103 frequency, because they got more suburban listeners. So it was a business decision to do the flip. And it was an interesting, it was a fun time. They hired Vanna White to come in and spin the wheel for the frequency so that we landed on a different frequency. We made a big party out of it. But for me, it was kind of interesting. It was a lot of work specifically for me, because every single produced sweeper and imaging piece that I had done for 103 had to be redone and changed to Hot 97, from 103, Hot 103 to Hot 97. So there was a lot of late nights before that switch for me in the
Burning
studio.
the midnight oil.
Yeah. In fact, a lot of my buddies, Bill Schultz was another production person at Hot, who was a great guy, and he was excited because he was able to finish all his work and went to the big party for the switch. And when the switch happened, I was still in my studio at the radio station, hurrying to try to catch up to get some things finished. So I never even got to take part in the party time of that event.
Man, you never got to see Vanna White turn the
Nope.
board and all of that good stuff.
I just saw the pictures. I didn't get to party.
Man, you missed out. Now, this was back before, I want to switch a little bit, talk about how before TV sounds were in stereo, they're primarily in mono. And I noticed that a lot of the local radio stations, and especially MTV in its early years, once everything became more stereo, they were used to do FM stereo hookups. Can you explain how that worked?
Well, I mean, we were, one of the things that I really enjoyed about Hot was we did a lot of what they used to call remotes. They still call them remotes, but it was, we would go to different clubs and broadcast live from the clubs and that sort of thing. And we would do promotions with MTV on other things. So there was a lot of interaction between the different facilities or different ways to get the word out there. There was a lot of kind of cooperation between things like MTV or different TV stations. That was fun. It really was. So, and I, I think when we produce things, I didn't really, at least personally, I didn't really ever think about the fact that a lot of their material was in mono. I would kind of produce it in as much fun and excitement in stereo as I could, because stereo added that excitement. The one thing you did have to be careful about, and it's something from a technical standpoint that a lot of people don't really realize, is the FM signal when you're listening in a car, or you're listening on, you're not streaming it if you're listening to it through a terrestrial transmission. As the signal gets weaker, it actually blends the channels more towards mono. You'd get less left and right, so you blend in towards mono. And as an audio engineer, one of the things that I make sure I teach the students that I have in my classes for audio is you need to listen to that signal in mono for what they call a phase, to make sure it's phase compatible. Because what happens is, if you have two wavelengths of sound that are just slightly different from each other, but the same sound mixed to mono, they can cancel each other out. And so you can have this beautiful, beautiful stereo spread in stereo headphones. But if all of a sudden somebody changes it to mono, it almost goes away. So one of the things that from a technical standpoint, as a producer back in those days, one of the things I was very aware of was making sure my production would sound as good in mono as it did in stereo, because oftentimes it would get blended.
Now, is there a difference in terms of sound? Let's say if you're listening to a radio station on FM, and then you have one that's an AM stereo.
AM stereo for me never, in my career, never really affected me, because I never worked for an AM stereo station. It never took off very much. And I don't know. Did you ever have a car or anything that had AM stereo in it?
No, by the time I came of age to remember radio, AM stereo and AM was pretty much talk, sports.
Yeah, it was talk radio, so it was all mono. Yeah, that was a last attempt. The AM stereo was kind of a last attempt to keep AM playing music, and it didn't carry enough. FM was just too clean and a better signal, a better sound. So people kind of abandoned the AM for music.
So that's pretty much why a lot of the music formats went from AM to FM, because the sound quality on FM was a lot better. Because at that time, before everybody switched over to FM, FM was pretty much for experimental music, AOR, deep cuts.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, in fact, before even they got to experimental music, a lot of it was the beautiful music, just the elevator music, the music you'd hear, with violins and that kind of thing. There weren't many FM radios out there in the very beginning. AM was the thing. And it wasn't until some of these alternative stations, not alternative, but album stations and the freeform stations started really taking off and going after a younger audience, that the FM radios started to sell.
Yeah, because I believe before Z100 came on the air, it was originally a beautiful music format before they flipped the top 40.
Yeah, and I think two formats before Hot 97, if I remember right, WAPP was album, but before that, I think it was a beautiful music station on the 103 frequency too.
Mm-hmm. Now, being from the Hoosier state, are you familiar with WOWO?
Absolutely, that's another 500,000, or a 50,000 watt blowtorch. But which was funny, because that was in Fort Wayne, which was not exactly a large city, but that radio station blanketed the entire Midwest with its signal.
Yeah, legendary station for their lineup from the fire escape from the Big Red Barn, or infamously, they set off the EBS tests back in, I believe it was the early 70s. Somebody had submitted the wrong message for the EBS test, emergency broadcast system, and everybody went into panic.
And yeah, everybody thought, uh-oh, it's the end of the world. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in fact, it was a sad day when things started changing with the regulations and things, because I remember when I heard that I think Westinghouse owned WOWO,
Yeah, Group
and they
W.
were selling it, and then somebody decided that they would take some money and accept the fact that they'd go to a lower signal at night or something like that. So they weren't the 50,000 watts anymore. So it was kind of sad.
Yeah, now the funny thing about radio stations is that depending on where you are, your signal could be blasting from, let's say, a market that's 30, 40 miles out. Because I had a chance to interview Cy Young, who was a personality at WQOK, K97.5 in Raleigh, North Carolina. He was telling me that when K97 first came on the air, they were coming in so strong that you could hear them in Greensboro, Winston-Salem, and that's a totally different market through that station's monitors.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, well, if you want to have some fun sometime, do some research and ask some people, interview some people about WLW in Cincinnati. It was one of the few stations, the only station. It was licensed during World War II. They built a 500,000 watt transmitter. Not 50,000. That was their regular signal, but they were licensed to go in emergency up to 500,000 watts because it was during the wartime. And when they tested that, because you have to understand the difference between AM, which is amplitude modulation, and FM, which is frequency modulation, the two different sciences of broadcast. But the amplitude modulation can actually resonate things. So farmers' tin roofs around, miles away from the transmitter when they went to 500,000 watts without a radio, not even a radio, the roofs would resonate and you could hear the music or the announcer of WLW just because it was a piece of metal. And people said they were picking it up on their fillings in their teeth.
That's crazy. You literally say, where are you listening from? I'm listening from the roof. You got a transistor?
Like, talk about having,
I'm literally listening from the roof.
Or talk about having voices in your head. If your fillings were picking up the station, it's like, well, those poor people could not turn it off.
Mm-hmm. Now, also before automation, like you mentioned earlier, live bodies were in the studio 24/7. But if you were lucky at a big market, or you could afford it if you had extra money lying around, you would have what was called a cart carousel, where you would have all your carts for your overnight hours loaded up. And then if you are the engineer, you hope and pray that these carts work. So that way you're not getting a call saying, we need you to come down to the station. Cart carousel 1 just went down.
When I was working at the local station when I was going to college, this was in Bloomington, Indiana, at Indiana University. The station I was working for was an AM and an FM. The FM had automated country format, and I was live many times. I did the overnight shift on the AM, and that was the same thing. The announcer tape would get out of sync every once in a while with the songs, and so this announcer would go, here's Merle Haggard singing, and then all of a sudden Dolly Parton would be playing in the background. And I wouldn't even, I didn't listen to the station because I was working on my station, and you get a phone call from a listener on the FM going, it's all messed up. And you'd have to run in there and reset things while your music was playing. It's like, you got 3 minutes during this song to run in and fix the other radio station.
Mm-hmm. So also during this time too, did you have to have a FCC license, or did they abolish the FCC test?
Over on the wall, right over there, is my federal communication license, which was technically called a third-class radio telephone operator's license. And back then, yes, if you were running the radio station, if you were on the air, most of the time, if there was not a technical engineer present, you had to take the transmitter readings. You had to look and make sure all the meters were correct. And if there were some situations where people were required to have what was called a first class license, that was a lot harder to get. The third class license was a little easier, but I remember studying and having to take it at the FCC office in Chicago. I had to drive up to Chicago and take the test in order to operate the radio station. But yeah, it's still over on the wall.
Yeah, it's an achievement, because some of the various people that I've spoken with that they had to take the FCC test said that it was like the bar exam for radio, where if you passed it on the first try, consider yourself a genius.
Yeah. No, it was not an easy test to pass. You had to do there's a lot of math and technical stuff involved, because it was all about transmitters and electricity and electronics.
Now, were there some exemptions to where if you met XXX criteria that you would be exempt from having to take the test and you would just automatically get it?
You know what? I'm not sure about that. I don't think so. I think it was a requirement. You had to have one. And I remember that it was serious business because you had to take the transmitter logs and you had to sign them and make track, keep track of the different technical numbers that were happening, the readings they used to call them. And there were times when a FCC inspector, without any notice, would stop into your radio station saying, let me see your transmitter logs. And if you'd forgotten to take that reading, it's like, oh, you were fined. You got a fine. And so it was serious business. You had to keep track of it.
Yeah, trust me, I worked in small market radio and I still had to do the transmitter log readings. And in addition to run your locally produced high school, college games on your
Yeah.
AM, make sure that your local and national spots were ran. And even in the AM studio, we had good old spin pots with the A&P switch in the middle.
Yep, absolutely. I remember those days.
Yeah, because carts, I mean, you really had to be delicate with carts. You couldn't just jam them in the machine because your cart could warble, tape could get ate up on air, and you were pretty much out of luck because the sales rep would come to you and be like, why is Jimmy's Magic Shop spot is not playing? You're costing me commission.
Yeah, you're costing the station money, and that's never a good thing. That's not good. That's not a good way to keep your job long term.
No, because that is the heartbeat of radio. For those of you that do not know, commission, especially if you can get a nightclub or a car dealership, ones that's going to spend money monthly and constantly, you're going to make a nice commission.
And that's the way the owner of the radio station makes their money. I mean, the commercials. A lot of people go, "Oh, I hate commercials," and I wish there weren't any commercials. And yet, that's why the music's free on radio. That's why you're not paying a monthly subscription fee like you would with Spotify or Pandora. It's free because of the commercials. The commercials are where it pays for you to listen to the music for free.
Now, does the imaging of stations change once there's a change in format? Because with Hot 97, it was, I want to say, maybe around 93 or 94, correct me if I'm wrong, where
92,
they started to go more hip-hop oriented and go away from more dance, and that was when Steve Smith came in to do consultant work.
Yep, and that was just an adaptation of style on my part, which everybody at the station changed their focus because it's who we were talking to. We were talking to a different audience while trying to keep as broad an audience as possible. But yeah, then we were using, it was like Funkmaster Flex came in and he would create certain tracks that we would use on the promotions. And you had Spinderella in there from Salt and Pepper doing a lot of stuff. It definitely, and Steve Smith had a ear for hip hop. He and I would meet every morning. He'd meet with everybody, but for imaging the radio station, he would have an idea in his head almost every morning of what he wanted to do that day to keep the image of the radio station as street as possible.
And with having a street approach, you want to target your target demo, but have a broad enough appeal to where it can be appeasing to advertisers, because advertisers love to look at, well, back in those days, diaries. Now it'll be the portable people meter to make sure what's your numbers looking like, what's your CUM, what's your TSL, to make sure that I'm going to put my money in the right place to maximize my dollars.
Well, and there was actually, there was one of the things that we had to deal with was, and it's unfortunate and it sounds so strange based on how we think socially today, but back then a lot of the advertisers, it was, for lack of a better term, it was racist. They were like, well, no, we don't really want that hip hop crowd. They don't spend money, or we don't want to advertise to them. And they learned fairly quickly that that's total BS. That everybody's got the money, and if you get enough listeners, it's absolutely a viable format. But there was some resistance for a while in the radio industry of the old hip hop format, because of it's like, no, it's we want those 18 to 24-year-old white kids or whatever. And it's weird to even, I feel uncomfortable even saying that now, because it's like, how the hell could that have actually been true back then? But it was. I mean, it unfortunately was a period where American business thought that way.
Yeah, because if you look at the higher ups, you see young urban African American males, females, and this music that's infiltrating the suburbs. You're saying, "Oh, this is getting too dark outside," if you know what I mean.
Yeah, and which was total BS. I mean, it was like it was frustrating. It was frustrating to be subjected to that attitude, and I mean, and I'll be the first person to go, and I'm obviously a white guy,
Right,
and I was pissed off about it. So I can't even imagine, what my fellow employees
right.
felt that were subjected to that because of the color of their skin.
Yeah, because you want the music of the streets, but you want the presentation like a Z100 or a WPLJ.
Yeah, I mean, we wanted to appeal to everybody, but at the same time, hip hop had to be authentic. I mean, it was a street. It came from the streets, and it was it. The last thing we wanted to do was water it down and make it white bread. We wanted to keep that legitimacy to it, which luckily we had so much help from the hip hop community at that point. Um, that we were really supported by the artists and the community, and that kind of taught us and gave us a guidance in what we wanted to do. And Steve Smith was good at that. Steve read the room very, very well.
Right, because if you take a look at back before hip hop became mainstream, a lot of AM radio stations were playing underground hip hop, R&B, like out in California, 1580 K-Day, or in
Yeah,
Tucson, Arizona, Power 1490, which was dance, hybrid oriented. And it was where a lot of these companies said, we want to try this, but we're going to err on the side of caution because, like we said, it was some veil coded language of let's not dip our toe all the way in the water, so to speak.
yep. But that's one of the things where I have a lot of respect for MS Broadcasting. And their corporate program director at the time was Rick Cummings. And Rick just, I mean, he wouldn't put up with that kind of thought. And he put Power 106 on the air in LA as a hip hop radio station, and evolved it from the dance to the hip hop, and then he helped the transition in New York from the dance format to hip hop, and he was a trailblazer. I mean, he was colorblind, which I thought was really an awesome. He is an awesome human being. He's a really cool dude.
Now, how are you able to transition your ear for sound and audio on the recording side, like when you're mixing and mastering, and notice like, hey, you may need to turn the EQ down and this on in order to have your record sound perfectly clear?
That's an art. I mean, it's something that I to this day I continue to craft and hone that art, because it's I mean, there are so many, and the technology today is so amazing that you can use. I mean, the power of a digital recorder that you have on your laptop today is far beyond what we had in a huge recording studio back in the day. So the talent today, it's kind of like back in the day when the word processor and the computer computer came in for doing word processing, and replaced the typewriter. Same kind of thing. Just because you can do it faster and more creatively and better on a word processor than you could on a typewriter doesn't make you a better writer. And it's the same thing with musicians. Just because we have this incredible new technology doesn't make you a better musician or a better recording engineer. And so there is still an art and a craft to it that I continue to want to learn. And one of the cool things is I'm privileged enough. I'm an instructor. I besides running my own sound design company, I'm an instructor at a place called the Conservatory of Recording Arts and Sciences. And I get to work with really talented students who really want to learn the music business as far as music engineering and recording. And it's awesome to watch some of these people go from when they come into the school to what they learn and how they can craft a song and, take a kick drum and mix it with a bass, a bass synth line, and then add some guitar in there or some beats, whatever, and create a great piece of music. They have access to several huge recording studios at the school, but they also have their laptops, and they can do things on their laptops that are absolutely hit quality.
Right.
And so it's crafting. It really is. You're right.
And how big of a game changer for the music industry was when MIDI came out?
Personally, it changed my life because as far as being a musician, I was a trumpet player, and a trumpet player only plays one note at a time. So, you don't play the chord, you just play one note of the chord as a trumpet player because the other trumpet plays the other note, that kind of thing. So I never really learned composition, and I wasn't really that good at percussion. I didn't have much rhythm. When MIDI came out, it was the first time that you were able to record a drum loop, and then go, no, I'm going to move that snare drum just a little bit here, and go back, and you could adjust things, or what they used to call step recording. You could go in and say, I want the kick on 1, 2, 3, and 4, and I want the snare on 2 and 4, whatever, and you could do that. So for me, that was the first time I was able to take the sounds that I heard in my head, the rhythms that I heard in my head, and I could create them finally. It was such a wonderful outlet for me. And so when MIDI came around, I jumped on that bandwagon incredibly quickly because it was just really fun. In fact, I've got one of my Roland MIDI recorders still in a case back in the studio back there that hasn't seen the light of day for probably 25 years. But that's what I started. I started on these MIDI recorders that were huge boxes, that kind of thing.
Yeah, but one instrument that really changed the game was the Moog Synthesizer. Now, if you go to my neck of the woods, North Carolina, in Asheville, there's a museum dedicated to Mr. Moog, where the synthesizer.
That is the museum, the Moogseum in Asheville. In fact, they're really active in helping schools with music programs and things like that. I have no idea if you knew this or not, but I'm actually on the board of advisors of the Bob Moog Foundation. That's something I'm very passionate about. And I don't know if you can see over my shoulder, but right above my finger right there, that box right there, that is a Moog modular synthesizer from the early days.
Wow.
That's one of the original Moog synthesizers. And the synthesizer was one of the things that got me incredibly involved in this business because it could make sounds that got your attention. Remember, I said earlier how I loved looking for sounds that got the listener's attention without interfering with the flow of the radio station. And synthesizers back then were the one thing that, it was a new sound. It was incredibly fun to do. And so that was something that I was really excited to get involved in.
Right. And one of the things that I found amazing with the early days of hip hop was that they took what they had and made do, because a lot of those early Marley Marl, Teddy Riley records were do it yourself. They would do it in a home studio and then maybe take it to a big studio like a Chung King, Power Play, Hit Factory to get it mastered and have that studio quality, but you can still hear that raw do it yourself aesthetic.
Or they would record everything in MIDI, and they would bring their synthesizers and their MIDI tracks to that studio, that big, expensive studio, but they would do all the MIDI work and do all the composition and do all the preparation at home and then bring it in there. Yeah, it opened up the music industry to so many people that would not have had the economic means to hire a big, expensive hourly rate studio.
Yeah, because prior to machines taking over, a lot of studios would have in-house musicians, or you would have somebody freelance say, hey, so-and-so is having a session down at blah, 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 go play horns for them. But it seemed like when America was taking on the machines, like at the start of the late 70s, early 80s with disco, Europe was already on it before it caught on over here in the States.
Yes. Yep. That is true. The States was a little, people in the beginning were a little scared that the synthesizer would replace musicians, which is not what happened at all. it was another color to the palette when you're painting, that kind of thing. But people were afraid, like, oh no, this is going to put all the violinists out of business. No one will play the piano anymore. And that didn't happen. It was just, it added a different sound and different possibilities.
Right, endless possibilities, because when you heard a lot of those records coming out of Europe, like the Donna Summer records that were produced by Giorgio Moroder,
Oh, I,
Kraftwerk.
yeah.
the-
One of the Giorgio Moroder is to me an amazing human being. I still remember the first time I heard "I Feel Love," and it was just like, oh, that arpeggiated line is like blew my mind. And then there's another um, uh, band out there that's not really a band; it's actually one person, but it's called Synergy, and that was some great, the beginning of electronic music and really well crafted synthesizer music. And that turned out to be, I didn't know this at the time until I was at a meeting in New Jersey, and the guy sitting next to me was a guy named Larry Fast, and we started talking, and it turns out he was Synergy. And I told him, I go, dude, your music is the reason why I got into that pulsing percussive music that I'm producing for the radio station, that kind of stuff. So it was an amazing subculture that ended up influencing every corner of music.
Yeah, then you have the talk box, and later, auto tune, and just taking forms of technology, adding it to the collage of great music. And people are just saying, we're gonna take technology, not fear it, but embrace it.
Right. Exactly. And once the really creative people started embracing it and doing that, and coming forward and climbing over the doubters, I mean, music really changed when you go back and listen to it. I mean, and some people, some people can make fun of or put down the technological part of that music, the producer heavy side of that, but it expanded what we listen to quite a bit.
Mm,
I still have some metalhead friends, that are rock and rollers that say, "Oh man, it's not this kind of stuff you're into ruined music." It's like, no, it didn't. No, it didn't.
no, no, no. I think it only enhances. So, in your opinion, good or bad, the telecom act of '96, how did that change radio and the landscape of broadcasting, good or bad?
Broke my heart. I've accepted it. It is what it is. You can't fight it. I mean, you can't swim upstream forever. But I think it changed radio drastically, and I think it took away from locality, the local side of radio. Up until that time, I think the DJs at a local radio station were kind of like local celebrities, and that went away. And then you also had, I mean, I'm growing up where I was growing up, we probably had 8 different people that owned different radio stations, and it was a friendly competition, but they all made better radio because they were all fighting against each other. Everybody was trying to do something better. And program directors, the bosses, the creative bosses at these radio stations would always try something interesting and new to stand out. And I think when we got into this big corporate radio environment for a while, I think it's changing, and I think it will continue to change. But for a while, it actually, the opposite happened. They wanted to keep their heads down and not cause any excitement or get noticed, because I don't want to get fired, kind of thing. So you had people doing somewhat mediocre radio for a while, just because they didn't want to do anything different, and everything started to sound the same. You didn't develop any new talent, any personalities. You didn't have a Broadway Bill Lee or a Dr. Dre and Ed Lover, because it was, no, we either have one superstar that's on all these different markets, syndicated or networked, or just shut up and play the music, and don't talk very much. And so you lost that hometown hero for a while. It's interesting because I've been out of the day-to-day radio business for a while now, and so I work with a lot of the large corporations, the owners of the big chains, and they're trying desperately to be as creative as they can. And I think they've tried different things. Some things have failed. Some things have gotten, done well. But I miss the people that have to work that. We talked about the overnight shift. We talked about that late night shift. That was a place for people to make mistakes because there weren't that many listeners, and it didn't matter. You put somebody on that shift, and they could grow. They could mold their personality and learn to be a good air personality. And there's not that many chances for that anymore. It's more difficult for someone to break into the business, make enough money to earn a living, and then stand out enough to continue to grow. So that's going to continue to affect the radio industry. I think, when you add in podcasts and add in streaming, you add in, Spotify and Pandora and that sort of thing, where, I mean, if I'm willing to spend a few dollars a month, somebody can listen to the radio playing their own songs without any commercials. And that's hard to compete against. That's hard for radio to compete against. So it is a changing world.
Yeah, it is, because a lot of kids now don't know the concept of waiting on the radio station to play your song maybe 15 minutes after you heard it, or being the 97th caller to win tickets to go see so-and-so, or DJ so-and-so is going to be at this burger joint broadcasting live from 10 to 2. And if we spot your bumper sticker, have a chance to win X amount of dollars. You just don't have that sense of familiarity and fun, because to me, the best thing about radio back when I was listening to it is knowing that so-and-so is going to be doing a remote. B, I get a call through to the radio station for a request show, and I get to take myself off the radio making the request, which I've done 3 times, and then getting seen with that station's, whether it's a bumper sticker, a t-shirt, a hat, something that says, I love this station and I feel that I'm a part of it.
And it made you, we talked, I mentioned earlier, like having the listener be a part of the family. And that's what made people be part of the family of that radio station, was being involved like that. It's like, oh my gosh, I got through and I was caller 97. And it's like what, and most of the time they didn't even know what they won. They just were happy to be the winner. And that was excitement. And that was interesting. And that we've lost that a little bit. And in fact, the importance of radio has shifted a little bit. I've got a friend of mine who's a boss at a major radio chain of, a group of radio stations. And I was talking to him, and his teenage son doesn't even own a radio. And that's his dad's business is radio. And this kid lives in a world where radio to him is not important. And that saddens me a little bit, because I think radio has its place. I was on the road in my truck last year, and a big storm popped up out of nowhere, and I was listening to the radio, and I was sad that I tuned around to a whole bunch of different radio stations, and none of them were talking about the storm. They were all pre-recorded, and so there was no local. In fact, this sounds so weird to me, being a huge radio fan, but I actually tuned to Sirius XM's Weather Channel, and they had information about Phoenix, Arizona weather, when none of the local radio stations did. And that's the thing that we need to fight. And that's, we need to get back to being that local source of entertainment. But it's splintered. It's never going to be back the way it was. I mean, when I grew up, there were usually, in whatever city you lived in, there were 3 TV stations. That was it. I mean, that's what you had to choice of, the 3 networks. And then all of a sudden cable happened, and you had all this different programming. That changed television, or that changed, the video industry. And that's what happened to radio. The audio delivery system has changed drastically. You've got streaming, you've got a million songs on your phone if you really want to listen to that. So it's going to continue to change and adapt if we want to keep it alive. And it'll stay. I mean, I'm a believer. It's not, in no way is this beautiful thing we've got going to die. It's going to evolve.
Right. Like how when MTV first debuted, they said video killed the radio star. Shout out to the Buggles. And now podcasting and streaming killed the radio star, because if you and I both know, being in the broadcasting business, about voice tracking and how they want to pay this one person to voice track for maybe 4 or 5 plus stations in the markets for whatever they own, and you lose that sense of regionality where DC radio is different from LA radio, Raleigh, North Carolina radio is different from Miami radio, where now is you have one corporate PD that's in charge of one particular format, and then they deliver a playlist to all their stations, say, you guys are going to play this. The only thing that's going to be localized be liners and news. And it really sucks to be a small market station now, because you can't get talent to go cut their teeth in small market, and you may be lucky to have 2 or 3 jocks, and then you fill out the rest of your programming with syndication.
Yeah, but that's not, that's changes. I mean, it's the smarter large companies are adapting and understanding that they need to develop local talent, or develop talent somehow. And then there's still, thank goodness, there's still some of the mom and pop owners out there that are running live radio stations, that are doing live and local. And it pays off. It really does.
Yeah, live and local is the best way to be. So tell us about Rick Allen Creative and what you got going on now.
Well, I when I left the day-to-day radio operation, I ended up launching I talked about earlier, the imaging service, where it was that stations could pick that up, and I could earn money by having that on many stations. Then it's been a blast. My career, I'm so blessed that I've been able to do what I always loved to do and gotten paid for it. I'm always scared someone's going to point at me and go, we're not going to pay you for this, because I'd still do it even if nobody paid me for it, because I love it. But I ended up getting into, while still being loyal and still doing a lot of radio work, I started recording sound effects collections for film and TV. And then I got into doing some sound work for games, and that sort of thing, and can expand that side of my revenue stream. My business is basically trying to get sounds put on network TV shows and movies and things like that. And it's that continues to be a lot of fun. It really is. It's when you get told that one of your little sounds is going to be, in a show in Europe or Australia or New Zealand, it's like, oh, cool. That's a thrill. So I still do audio. I will always do audio. But now I'm going out and recording huge explosions out in the desert, and recording sound effects of gunfire and glass breaking and that sort of thing, and putting those collections together, making it available for other sound editors to use in their video production.
Fun. Now, one more thing before we wrap. We talked about the home studio. Now, I want to know, in the beginning of the home studio, did you have all your equipment right there, or did you have to add piece by piece?
Oh, piece by piece. Although when I first did it, it's very much like today. If somebody said, "Okay, I'm going to buy a laptop and I'm going to get a digital workstation software program," I had to have something in the very beginning. So that was the first and only time I ever took out a loan to get equipment. And I put together a multi-track tape machine, a mastering tape machine, a mixing console, and a few other pieces of gear was my first thing. And that was back. That was back in the 80s, and from then it was piece by piece by piece. And I laugh because every once in a while I look around my studio and go, "Wow, I've got a lot of stuff." and it's been over the years that a little piece here, a little piece there, and all of a sudden and thank goodness we live in a world where some of the older analog vintage gear is sought after. So I laugh because most of the gear in my studio is vintage, but it shows you how old I am. I bought it when it wasn't vintage. I bought it when it was newer. It kind of grew into being the old vintage gear. But yeah, it took quite a long time.
What's old is new, because I believe Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis out in their Flight Time studio out west, they pretty much got every piece of equipment they've used and they just refurbished it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's like, when I look at some of the older gear that I got at a a fire sale price, because at the time everybody was saying, hey, digital gear is the new thing. Everybody's getting rid of the analog gear. And I bought up quite a bit of that gear just because I like the sound of it. And then years later, things that I got for $100 because nobody wanted them. Now, they're going for $5,000, $6,000. And the one time that I sold a couple of vintage pieces that I had because I thought I didn't need them anymore, one of my biggest regrets, because it's like, no, I want that back, and it's gone. I sold my baby, that kind of thing. So it's I'm an equipment pack rat. So if I bought it, I probably still have it.
As long as you keep it in good condition, and the more rare it is, the value goes up. It gets treated like baseball, basketball, sporting cards, where the value appreciates over time, and the more significant it is a one of a kind. Because if you look at the 808, originally, before it skyrocketed in popularity, you could get them at bargain basement prices at a flea market or a yard sale. But now they're going to go for like thousands of dollars.
Absolutely. No, totally agree with you on that one. Yeah.
So hold on to your old stuff and never sell, and unless the price is right, a la Bob Barker. Yeah, unless the price is right. Now, do you have any shout outs you want to give before we wrap this interview, and also plug your social media?
I tell you, I just want to, over the years, I can't tell you how many people have mentored me and given me advice. The staff at Hot 103 and Hot 97, they're still family. I haven't seen them physically for years now, but they're my brothers and sisters, man. I mean, we just, everything I did that I'm very proud of would have meant nothing had we not had the support staff and all the other people doing what they needed to do so well. It was an incredible group of people, and I've been lucky. I say that about everybody that I've worked with in my career. I really haven't worked with anybody that I wouldn't want to work with again. I've had the wonderful chance to work with some great people, and I feel very, very lucky about that. And I've been able to build my business doing what I love to do. And if anybody cares, they want to check it out. It's rickallencreative.com is my website. And it's also my Instagram and my Facebook and my YouTube channel is all, Rick Allen Creative, one word at the end of all that stuff. So check it out. It's kind of fun to see what this crazy old man is doing these days to stay young. I'm still trying to stay relevant, and hopefully I am. Having fun, and I'm gonna be having fun till I go out, man.
Hey, if you gotta go out with a bang. Check them out on all those platforms. You can catch this interview on audio and video platforms, available on Anchor, Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, Verbal, wherever you stream your podcast, and on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Beyond the Album Cover. Like, subscribe, follow, tell a friend. Ladies and gentlemen, the imaging extraordinaire. If you've listened to games, radio, TV for the past 4 decades, you know the man. He's primarily behind the scenes, but today on Beyond the Album Cover, he's in front of the camera. So enjoy this. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Rick Allen. Mr. Allen, thank you so very much for coming on to the podcast, sir.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate you having me, man.
Not a problem.